OnGodStudioProduction513 space using screen recorder today, talking about James Garfield. I speak a lot on Nicola Tesla, but this gentleman right here is another pivot point in unearthing America's treasures and finding the actual ways that the Masons were able to use aerial views to construct our transit system for the solar project.
In 1881, James Garfield became the second U.S. president to be assassinated. But while Abraham Lincoln died a martyr 16 years earlier for union and liberty, Garfield was killed for a less glorious cause, civil service reform. Well, that doesn't seem like a big deal now. It was then. This was a time when most government positions were obtained through political connections. This practice, known as patronage, or the spoils system, was the way both Republicans and Democrats held power. It created a lot of party loyalty. You owed your job to the party, but also led to a lot of incompetence and corruption. Garfield was the first president to seriously challenge this system. He took on the party bosses who doled out jobs and instead appointed qualified civil servants on the basis of merit. This courageous act cost America.
The first steamboat to operate on Western waters found its way to the Cincinnati port. Known as the Orleans, this 200-ton vessel was met with much fanfare.
But these are other systems of transit in Ohio. What I want you to focus on is...
will enjoy 20% off. And now, back to Cincinnati's forgotten subway. Welcome to Cincinnati, Ohio, home to around 2 million today. It is America's 29th largest city and Ohio's largest metropolitan area. The city began in 1788 when Colonel Robert Patterson and Israel Ludlow decided to settle there. And by 1811, with the advancements in steamboats, the Ohio River brought commercial ties with St. Louis and New Orleans. Cincinnati was incorporated as a city on March the 1st, 1891. Around this time, exporting pork products and hay put the town on the map. And with only a few decades, the city's population tripled. From that point, Cincinnati was surging thanks to newfound business brought in by the Miami and Erie Canal. Additionally, the many railroads that were adding the city to its schedule extended the city's commercial reach to the point that employers were struggling to hire enough people to fill positions. The town answered these labor shortages with waves of Irish and German immigrants who continued to grow the city's population and subsequent prosperity. Naturally, the city needed to develop its infrastructure to support and enable its new citizens, and in many ways, public transportation was at the heart of this new reality. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Cincinnati's public transportation industry saw many changes. However, it first started with the horse-drawn carriages and omnibuses typical of the early 1800s in most cities. In the mid-1800s, metal rails were embedded in the streets to give passengers a much smoother and less bumpy ride, reducing friction and allowing horses to pull heavier loads. By 1880, the Central Basin had 8 horse-car lines in full operation. However, the areas outside it were an entirely different story due to the city's steep hills, though eventually it would be solved by developing many inclines that would later become a part of Cincinnati's early suburbs. Metro Cincinnati remarks that these inclines, quote, functioned as a cross between railroad and elevator. Horse cars, cable cars, and street cars were driven onto level platforms, then pulled along the top of hills by cables along a sloped track. Typically, these inclines had 2 tracks with counterbalanced platforms. Starting in 1872, a series of 5 inclines were built. The last one stopped operating in 1948. The rise of cable cars in other large cities such as San Francisco had reached Cincinnati in the 1880s in the form of 3 routes. Although in the end, the city's brief use of cable cars was more of a transitional phase for the city since they lasted just 20 years. All of the routes were either abandoned or turned into electric streetcars. In 1889, Cincinnati would see its very first electric streetcar on the main street line, and over the next few years, most of its remaining horse cars and cable car lines.
Oh, it's so much recording.
My program just gives you the freedom to do the work whenever you have time, so it takes away a lot of stress.
Were also electrified. You see, Cincinnati had a rather unique system. At that time, most streetcar systems operated under a single supply wire, while running rails that worked as the ground return. Cincinnati's system, however, had its electric power provided through two overhead wires. One worked as supply and the other worked as the return. In many ways, this system became the heart of the city, and it ran no matter what, even throughout the violent strike of 1913. With time, the system grew to 200 miles of track, serving 100 million passengers over the decades that it was active. Yet the city still had higher ambitions, and hence the idea of a subway started to creep into the minds of the authorities that ruled Cincinnati. And whereas the concept of a subway within a metropolitan makes a lot of sense, you simply won't believe where they wanted to build it.
It would have been great solar. Perfect
the Miami and Erie Canal was part of a massive series of waterways that ran throughout Ohio and the Midwest. It was at its peak in 1850, carrying both Cincinnatians and various goods from the city throughout the country. But by 1880, this canal had already lost much of its relevance, turning into little more than an unused backwater, known by few and used by next to none. The canal and its boats were quickly being replaced by faster and more efficient trains. On September the 27th, 1884,
see what happened there with the technology.
One of Cincinnati's popular newspapers printed
faster,
a picture
quicker.
that would change everything.
After that, but what did it do to us?
This picture showed the canal
physically,
being replaced by a gorgeous street. Underneath it sat a subway, complete with steam trains. For the first time since the early 1880s, the lost Miami and Erie Canal site would have purpose again. But more than that, this dream of a subway system soon became one many Cincinnatians who hadn't even considered before it began to aspire towards. But that old newspaper clipping was not the only reason that construction ultimately began. You see, at the turn of the century, Cincinnati thrived as not only one of the Midwest's leading trade centers, but as one of America's top 10 largest cities. As we discussed before, there was significant demand for a faster way to transport passengers in and out of the downtown area. And by March of 1912, cities rallied around an attempt when the county appointed a 3-person Board of Rapid Transit Commission to find a way to make rapid transit happen in Cincinnati. The original price for the construction plan proposed was an estimated $12 million, but it had to be reduced to $6 million. The proposed loop would run 16 miles and use the former Miami and Erie Canal's bed to build the portions of the tunnel under Central Parkway. This short subway portion would be built downtown, then run through the canal to Brighton, surfacing through the Mill Creek Valley to St. Bernard. Trains would then run east through Norwood and south through Oakley and Evanston to the river, which it would follow upon its way back downtown on an elevated runway. And importantly, the connection would have offered a convenient transfer onto interurban trains that terminated at Race Street. Not long after bonds were issued, the city of Cincinnati leased out part of the right-of-way of the old Miami and Erie Canal from the state of Ohio, raising about $50,000 in funds for surveying and estimations. In 1916, Cincinnati voters approved a $6 million bond and granted it by an almost unanimous vote of 6-1. Previously, Cincinnati having its own subway system was something that many never even considered, and yet it was well on track to becoming a reality.
And not only was it a transit system, it's a regenerator.
In the coming years, worst of which was the First World War.
Yes.
World War I was a significant setback to the proposed tunnel development, putting it off until January the 28th,
all of it links to the same thing.
When the first steam shovel met the dirt of the canal at Walnut Street. As time went on, however, more and more Cincinnatians began to doubt that the $6 million bond would be enough to complete the job due to inflation.
Y'all had $6 million.
Initially, Rapid Transit Board set these concerns aside and continued construction, focusing on the less expensive downtown subway portion first, as they believed that it would be easier.
Fuck these
By
niggas
early
up.
1921,
Fuck them up.
Construction costs spelled disaster.
He out there trying to save this world.
The granted
you try to prevent him from giving the money back.
Exhausted
type
well
shit is this?
The original 16 miles proposed were to be completed. It seemed that at best, only 11 miles were possible. They would have to make a significant compromise and eliminate the entire eastern part of the loop from Oakley to downtown, but this was far from the only problem that the Cincinnati subway faced. The project was also delayed by negotiations with St. Bernard and Norwood residents.
How many people don't die?
It was then delayed again in 1922 for over 2 months.
Don't want to go green.
Being blasted
Don't want to breathe.
that caused damage
You don't have to smell it, did you?
Well, 2 miles of subway tunnels were completed in 1923, and its above-ground sections were close to being finished by early 1927. There was no money to equip them properly. The bond had been completely exhausted, and yet there were still no tracks laid. Many essential parts of the system were missing. Additionally, another reason for the 5 remaining miles of proposed route not being built was that the subway failed to obtain the right-of-way. Construction was officially halted in 1928, and it seemed as if the Cincinnati subway system was nothing more than a pipe dream. For a long while, just over 2 miles of unused subway tunnel worth $6 million laid forgotten beneath the busy streets of Cincinnati. As even in 1928, estimations suggested that it would take another $9 to $10 million to save the subway, cash that just did not exist at the time. And so the sheer amount of money that the subway would cost quickly diminished any remaining interest, and the Cincinnati subway only fell further into its early grave, thanks to the Great Depression. Even the interurban rail lines were steadily going bankrupt, and the population was no longer so closely clustered together in serviceable areas to justify such major investment. Mix that with the up-and-coming motor car, and the situation was dire. It wasn't until 1936 that the Cincinnati Engineers Club proposed that the city trolley system could be connected to the subway via the abandoned tunnels. However, this was quickly shut down because the streetcars were too long to make the curves that the subway had. In 1939, the city manager proposed that the subway tunnels could be extended as downtown riverfront parking. Though while the cars would fit, the cost was still too great. Then, just after World War II, a local business interest wanted to lease part of the subway between Plum Street and
made anything to check was between my legs.
Railroad cars, which would
like your death teach them what not to do.
The station at Liberty Street under the Burger Brewing Company was intended to be the main loading point. And even though the city approved a 5-year lease for the project, it was later discovered that the freight cars would not fit through the subway tunnels, and the plan was foiled. In 1948, a comprehensive study took place, and the city recommended
my uncle was a year old
to forget the entire project.
And he was already one of the promises of the treasure. He was right here.
Altogether.
Heartland.
Be that as it may, these
America.
actually did
was he not the Reverend?
1960s, just not in the way that they were originally designed. Let me explain. Amidst the looming Cold War, it was decided that the subway tunnels would be ideal as an underground fallout shelter to protect citizens in the event of a bombing. One station was renovated and completely revamped.
I always want to go to war.
With toilets.
Now, if they had done a technology and listen, would they have went to war?
Shelter never served its necessity.
Would they have been fighting about whose energy it was?
Many of these lost subway stations still sit under Central Parkway, abandoned and hollow, but still intact. They never saw passenger service, but they are still maintained by the city, undergoing various inspections and
time travelers everywhere now.
Tours of these
you should have known I was a woman the whole time. Would you have done it?
2015,
well,
but public
now they know why we record and computerized.
The tunnels are restricted.
Yeah,
it's totally illegal to enter them over safety concerns. And although it might seem like the story ends here, there are many plans to decide the final fate of Cincinnati's tragically unrealized system. And I have to admit, some of the ideas are pretty creative. For example, back in 1969, the Diocese of Southern Ohio wanted to hold a candlelight communion service in what they called, quote, catacombs of Cincinnati. However, the church officials couldn't get insurance for it. And this event never took place. Years later, the Myers Winery wanted to convert part of the subway into an underground winery, storing many locally produced wines in the area that tourists would be able to come and visit, though the city also shot this idea down. In 1974, a local group intended to lease part of the subway tunnels to be converted into retail shopping areas and nightclubs. Then 3 years later, the Ohio,
You
Kentucky,
can stop my heart
Indiana
if you
Mass
want to.
Transit Committee
It won't
proposed
stop what
a
was
light
happening.
rail massive
It
transit
won't stop
system
this type
for
of stuff.
Cincinnati. Following the
Handle
footsteps of
your
Chicago,
business,
this
you
massive
coward.
system would connect the suburbs and the western side of town with the downtown area and cut down traffic congestion, air pollution, and so on. The proposed line could be developed in one of two ways. The first is that the Mill Creek could be bridged with a line leading into the Union Terminal area or the riverfront. Alternatively, it could be linked with an existing subway and run across Central Parkway, down Main Street, and out to grade at the surface near the riverfront. But after so many decades, all these ideas just seem like a thing of fantasy. With many catching buses at Government Square today, it is difficult to imagine what it might look like if Cincinnati's subway system indeed came to light. Yet under the busy streets, these underground stations and lines sit and abandoned.
Enjoy.
Lost to time, forgotten by the vast majority of Cincinnatians. You might say that this is a true example of lost potential, with the opportunity to serve thousands, if not millions of passengers every year, just gone with the wind. Keep this story alive by sharing. Don't forget to subscribe to its history. And until next time, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.